The Marvel Cinematic Universe has been going strong for over a decade now and shows no sign of slowing down anytime soon. In that time, the heroes featured in these properties have found global popularity. Obscure characters have become household names, B-listers have gotten their time in the spotlight, and heroes who were always popular have found renewed relevancy for the 21st century. The villains, however, have often gotten the short end of the stick. Though not always, the villains more often than not act as a plot device, as opposed to a fully fledged character. This seems like it's not as big a problem anymore, but in the early days the only one who was able to prosper was Loki. Since then, Loki has grown into a lovable antihero who's all set to go on a bunch of wacky adventures across reality. This personality has also been adapted into the comic universe following his death and resurrection. Previously, he had been a memorable, if a little one-note adversary to Thor and other characters across the Marvel universe. What I want to talk about today is what I consider an anomaly for the God of Mischief pre-MCU. It's the miniseries Loki from 2004 and tells the story of an alternate reality where Loki is able to overthrow Odin and best Thor in combat, becoming the new king of Asgard. At the start, it all seems to play out predictably. Loki gloats over his defeated brother and revels in the glory at finally coming out on top. He carries on like this until he is visited by Hela, the goddess of death, who has come to ask when Thor will be executed so that she may claim his soul. This comes as a surprise to Loki, who had no plans to kill Thor, but rather to keep him alive to stew in his own failure. Hela, however, convinces him that as long as Thor lives, Loki's reign is threatened. With Thor's fate now decided, this sends Loki on a journey of self-exploration on what his life would even mean without his brother. The comic centers around Loki struggling with maintaining his image as a cruel overlord, while not really wanting to go through with any of the work. Aside from the initial moments of glory, Loki spends the majority of the comic as he did the majority of his life, sulking and alone. The only difference now being that even though he's still reviled in Asgard, he now has the responsibility of watching over and protecting them, causing him to be annoyed and overwhelmed at the workload. As a ruler, Loki shirks all the bureaucratic responsibilities, clearly only wanting the fun parts. He lacks the drive to actually buckle down and act as king, so he spends most of the story avoiding his advisors and choosing to instead gloat over his fallen enemies. That's where the story truly gets interesting. Loki interacting with characters that readers have come to see as heroes, but that he views as tormentors. One by one, we begin to see how each of these supposedly noble characters contributed to Loki's descent into villainy. Whether it's Thor's on and off flame lady Sif, who would constantly belittle and degrade him in an attempt to entertain Thor, or Baldur, the god who is beloved by everyone, who would never even acknowledge him. Both characters willingly adding to Loki's inferiority complex and making him feel like an other in the only home he ever knew. Which leads us to the cruelest of all, Odin the Allfather, the dethroned king of Asgard. Loki confronts his adopted father about halfway through the series, and the conversation starts with Odin saying that he's surprised Loki can even stand to look at him, implying Loki should feel great shame. Odin laments his failure as a father to Loki, which he was, but Loki tells him that he actually succeeded spectacularly. The trickster claims that he has seen through Odin's lies. The claims that Odin took him as a child from his slain father as an attempt to forge a bond between Asgardians and frost giants was all just posturing, fabrications to hide Loki's true purpose. Loki reveals that he now knows that the only reason he was ever brought to the royal court was to make Thor look better by comparison. Odin had always planned for Thor to become a beacon of hope, a hero symbolic of Asgard itself. Loki explains that the best way to do that was to have a contrast for Thor's heroism, a figure that people could decry and clearly point to being the lesser of the two. Loki became exactly what Odin wanted, a black sheet that Thor could shine off of. Odin initially denies this, but when Loki tells him to look at him and say he's wrong, it's Odin who's unable to look at Loki. So, with this journey trip down memory lane, Loki should be ready and raring to kill Thor, the brother he always fell short of. And yet, he still hesitates, still seemingly unconvinced that it's the correct course of action. After his discussions with the figures of his past, one part seemingly sticks in his mind. When he spoke with Baldur, the imprisoned god told Loki that he had seen many things in his lifetime, including things from alternate timelines. He spoke to Loki of different Lokis. He said how some were very similar, and others were Loki-esque figures in other ancient religions. He told of all sorts of origins and different roles that Loki played in various pantheons, but he made it very clear that there was one uniting factor across all Lokis. No Loki, at any point in time, ever manages to rule. Obviously, the thought of predestination becomes a sticking point for Loki, a fear that needs addressing. So he enlists the help of Karnilla, Queen of the Norns, and sometimes villain, sometimes ally, who, in this reality, helped Loki take over Asgard. With her magical abilities, she is able to show Loki all those variant versions that Baldur spoke of. Loki requests to know what fate befalls them, and Karnilla shows him that all of Loki's fates can be surmised by this image. A defeated Loki is chained to a rock, and over him lies a poisonous worm that will inevitably get its venom in his eyes. So, basically, failure in every timeline. Naturally, the thought of being forever destined to failure concerns Loki. It also helps confirm Hela's claim that as long as Thor lives, Loki is celebrating on borrowed time. While the path seems clear, the new king continues to have reservations. By the next morning, mere hours before Thor is scheduled to die, Loki quietly monologues to himself, clearly still not making up his mind. He admits the irony in Thor being the only person to ever show him any humanity or compassion in life, and yet it's him that will pay for the lifetime of ridicule and abuse. Hela arrives again, hoping to expedite the process, but Loki quickly tires of her eagerness. Hela gets angry at being dismissed and confronts Loki, demanding to know what the issue is and why he's being so difficult if this is his will finally realized. It's then that Loki finally concedes that this isn't what he wants. Hela seemingly tries to goad Loki into going through with the execution anyway, but desists when he doesn't budge. Loki, meanwhile, leaves in extremely good spirits, now planning to release Thor and hopefully repair their kinship. He walks confidently toward the dungeon, knowing well that it won't be easy to convince Thor of his change of heart, but he's finally ready to put in the necessary work to take his place by his brother's side. It is at this point that there is a giant explosion from the dungeon under Loki's feet. As the dust and rubble settle, it's clear what's happened. Thor has freed himself. Realizing how bad this all looks, Loki panics and begins to try to explain to Thor what's actually going on. He begs him to wait and listen, begs him to show mercy and to not confine them both once again to their destiny. Loki cries out for his brother one last time, as Thor brings down his hammer and kills him. Written by acclaimed novelist Robert Rhodey, with art beautifully painted by Esad Rabik, this story acts, at least in my opinion, as the blueprint for Loki's characterization in the modern era. While different writers have brought new elements to the character since the 60s, this is the earliest example I've read that really lays bare what makes the character tick. Obviously, the debate of nature versus nurture has been discussed by many people much smarter than me for decades, and while I have pretty much nothing to add to that discussion, I will say that if someone went through life being treated as an inferior, and being dismissed, and ridiculed, and tormented, well, how much can you really expect out of someone who's taught nothing but hate? I'm personally not a fan of stories that exonerate villains just because of a rough past. Just feels cheap to me. This story, however, while portraying Loki in a sympathetic light, does not dance around the fact that he is also straight up the worst. Obviously everyone else sucks too, including Thor for not standing up and saying something, but Loki clearly isn't a saint either. Cutting off Sif's hair for her taunts, he tried to murder Balder for not teaching him how to sing to birds. All signs are there to remind the reader that Loki isn't a figure to aspire to. We should feel bad for him, certainly, but that isn't exactly a role model. The only thing that really sets apart Loki in this story is his willingness to change. Everyone he talks to throughout the story continue to view him with disdain, uncompromising in their decision to view him as a villain that they can't admit they helped create. Loki, on the other hand, chooses to take this time to reevaluate his life and his actions and decides he wants to do better. Unfortunately, he's trapped by fate and its inevitability, a concept that I personally find quite frightening and which is used brilliantly in the closing pages, retroactively making the whole story seem a little surreal and almost horrific in qualities. All those moments of reflection, all that growth, all just to be reminded of the seemingly universal truth that Loki does not win. Of course, this story is not official canon to the main Marvel universe, and there are many different iterations of Loki. If you'd like to see me cover any other Loki stories, please let me know because I'd love to take a look. As always, thank you so much for joining me. I've been the Watcher of New Earth, and I hope to see you again.